The summer heat pressed down on Clearwater Lake like a heavy blanket, sending families flocking to the sandy shores in search of relief. Children's laughter mixed with the gentle lapping of water against the dock, creating the perfect soundtrack for a lazy Saturday afternoon. But in a matter of seconds, paradise would transform into chaos, and one woman's split-second decision would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her sunglasses and took a sip of her iced coffee, trying to steal a few precious moments of peace before her evening shift at Memorial General Hospital. As a pediatric nurse with 8 years of experience, she rarely had weekends to herself, but today was different. Today, she had finally carved out time to breathe, to remember what life felt like outside the sterile walls of the emergency room. The lake stretched before her like a mirror, reflecting the cloudless sky and the silhouettes of swimmers enjoying the perfect weather. Families dotted the beach with their colorful umbrellas and coolers, creating a patchwork of summer joy. Sarah watched as parents chased toddlers through the shallow water while teenagers showed off on jet skis in the distance. Everything seemed perfectly normal, beautifully ordinary. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her colleague Michael Chen, reminding her about the new hospital protocols they'd implemented the previous week. She smiled, remembering how they'd both complained about the endless paperwork and administrative changes that seemed to prioritize bureaucracy over patient care. Dr. Patricia Williams, their stern supervisor, had made it crystal clear that any deviation from protocol would result in immediate disciplinary action. Sarah had rolled her eyes at the time, thinking about how some rules seemed designed to protect the hospital's reputation rather than serve the patients they'd sworn to help. The irony wasn't lost on her that even on her day off, work followed her everywhere. But that's what happened when you cared too much, when you chose a profession that demanded everything from your heart, your time, and your soul. Sarah had always been the type of person who couldn't walk away from someone in need, a trait that had served her well in nursing but sometimes complicated her personal life. She set her phone aside and tried to focus on the present moment. A group of children nearby were building an elaborate sandcastle, their concentration absolute as they shaped towers and moats with plastic buckets and shovels. Their parents sat in beach chairs, occasionally glancing up from their novels to offer encouragement or warnings about staying close to shore. The scene was so peaceful, so perfectly normal, that what happened next would seem almost impossible to believe. The first scream cut through the afternoon air like a knife. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound, her nursing instincts immediately taking over. Near the wooden dock about 50 yards away, a woman was pointing frantically at the water, her voice rising in panic. Other beachgoers began to notice, conversations stopping mid-sentence as heads turned toward the commotion. "Help! Someone help! My children!" The woman's voice carried across the water with desperate urgency. Sarah was on her feet before her conscious mind even processed what was happening. Years of emergency training had conditioned her to respond instantly to distress calls, and she found herself running toward the dock while other people were still trying to figure out what was wrong. Her bare feet hit the hot sand with purpose, dodging beach toys and surprised sunbathers as she made her way toward the crisis. As she got closer, the situation became horrifyingly clear. 2 small figures were struggling in the water about 20 feet from the dock, their heads barely visible above the surface. The children appeared to be twins, a boy and a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. They had somehow gotten caught in a current that was pulling them away from the shallow water toward the deeper center of the lake. The woman on the dock, Sarah now realized, was their mother, was reaching out desperately. But the children were too far away. Other adults were shouting suggestions and looking around frantically for life preservers or anything that might help. But those crucial first seconds were ticking away while the twins fought to keep their heads above water. Sarah didn't hesitate. Without pausing to consider the implications or calculate the risks, she dove cleanly off the end of the dock, her body cutting through the water with practiced efficiency. She had been a competitive swimmer in college, and muscle memory took over as she powered through the lake toward the struggling children. The water was surprisingly cold beneath the surface, and she could feel the same current that had caught the twins trying to pull her off course. But Sarah was strong, and more importantly, she was determined. Behind her, she could hear more shouting as other beachgoers realized what was happening, but she blocked out the noise and focused entirely on reaching Emma and Jake before it was too late. The little girl, Emma, was the first to spot Sarah approaching. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was coughing up water as she tried to stay afloat. Her twin brother Jake was a few feet away, his movements becoming weaker as exhaustion set in. Sarah could see that they had maybe 30 seconds before one or both of them would go under for good. "I've got you!" Sarah called out as she reached Emma first, wrapping one arm around the child's chest and pulling her close. "You're safe now. I need you to hold on to me and try to relax." Emma's small hands clutched at Sarah's shoulders with desperate strength, her whole body shaking from cold and fear. Sarah used her free arm to swim toward Jake, fighting against the current that seemed determined to drag them all toward the deeper water. The boy's head dipped below the surface just as she reached him, and Sarah had to dive down to grab him, feeling his unconscious weight as she brought him back up. Now she had both children, one unconscious and one terrified, and she was still 20 feet from safety with a current working against her. Sarah's training kicked in as she positioned herself to swim back toward shore using a modified side stroke that would allow her to keep both children's heads above water. Her muscles burned from the effort, and she could taste the metallic flavor of adrenaline in her mouth. The swim back to shore felt like it took hours, though it was probably less than 2 minutes. Sarah focused on steady, powerful strokes, while constantly checking to make sure both children were breathing. Emma was conscious but weak, still clinging to Sarah with trembling hands. Jake remained unconscious, his body limp in Sarah's grip, which terrified her more than she wanted to admit. Finally, her feet touched the sandy bottom near the shore, and willing hands reached out to help pull them all to safety. The children's mother was crying and reaching for her twins, while other beachgoers formed a circle around them, some offering towels, while others called emergency services on their phones. Sarah immediately went into full medical mode, checking Jake's breathing and pulse while gently positioning him for recovery. He was breathing, but weakly, and she could see that he had taken in a significant amount of water. Emma was conscious and responsive, coughing up lake water but otherwise seeming stable. "We need to get them to a hospital immediately," Sarah announced to the growing crowd. "They both need to be checked for secondary drowning, and this little guy needs immediate attention." The mother, whose name Sarah learned was Claire Thompson, was overwhelmed with gratitude and terror in equal measure. Thank you so much," she kept repeating while stroking her children's wet hair. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air as emergency responders arrived at the scene. Paramedics immediately took over the children's care, while police officers began interviewing witnesses and taking statements about what had happened. Sarah found herself wrapped in a towel, still dripping wet, as she explained the situation to Officer David Martinez. "You're a nurse?" Officer Martinez asked, making notes on his pad. "Pediatric nurse at Memorial General," Sarah confirmed. 8 years of experience. I could see they were in real trouble, so I acted." "Good thing you were here," the officer said. "These kids are lucky you knew what you were doing." As the paramedics prepared to transport Emma and Jake to the Khaki hospital, Claire Thompson approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "I need to know your name," she said. "I need to be able to thank you properly for saving my children's lives." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied simply. "I'm just glad I could help. Make sure they get checked thoroughly at the hospital. Secondary drowning can happen hours later." Claire nodded, memorizing the name as if it were the most important information in the world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah Mitchell. I'll never forget that name. The ambulance pulled away with lights flashing, carrying the twins and their mother toward Memorial General Hospital. As the crowd began to disperse and the beach slowly returned to normal, Sarah realized that her peaceful afternoon had been replaced by something much more significant. She had no way of knowing that her split-second decision to dive into that lake would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about courage, consequences, and the true meaning of doing what's right. What Sarah also didn't know was that Claire Thompson had been trying to reach her husband Robert all afternoon, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails about the accident. Robert Thompson was in back-to-back meetings at Thompson Industries, the development company he had built from nothing into one of the most influential businesses in Riverside City. His assistant, Mark, had been instructed not to interrupt him unless it was a true emergency, and Claire's first few calls had been vague enough that Mark hadn't felt they met that threshold. It wouldn't be until much later that evening, when Robert finally listened to his messages, that he would learn his children had nearly drowned and that a stranger had risked her own life to save them. By then, Sarah would be facing consequences she never could have imagined, and the stage would be set for a confrontation that would change multiple lives forever. As Sarah drove home that evening, her hair still damp from the lake, and her clothes carrying the scent of fresh water, she felt the familiar satisfaction that came from helping people in crisis. She had acted instinctively, the way any decent person would have acted, and she had been able to make a difference when it mattered most. In her mind, it was just another day of doing what felt right, of living up to the oath she had taken when she became a nurse. She had no idea that by Monday morning, that same instinctive compassion would put her career in jeopardy and force her to confront a system that valued rules over results, protocol over people. The lake had been calm when she left it that afternoon, its surface once again reflecting the peaceful sky, as if nothing dramatic had ever happened there. But like the deceptively still water that had hidden dangerous currents beneath, the events of that day were about to reveal depths that no one could have predicted. Sarah Mitchell went to bed that night thinking about Emma and Jake Thompson, hoping they were recovering well and that their family could move past the trauma of nearly losing two precious lives. She fell asleep with the satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference, completely unaware that across town Robert Thompson was finally learning about the woman who had saved his children and beginning to ask questions that would soon turn her world upside down. The story was just beginning, and none of the players yet understood the roles they were about to play in a drama that would test the boundaries of gratitude, power, and justice in ways that would surprise them all. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually energized Sarah for her work week ahead. She pulled into the employee parking lot at Memorial General Hospital with a travel mug of coffee in one hand and her nursing bag slung over her shoulder, feeling refreshed after a weekend that had reminded her why she loved her profession. The memory of saving Emma and Jake Thompson still filled her with quiet pride, the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing you had made a real difference when it mattered most. The hospital's morning routine was in full swing as Sarah made her way through the familiar corridors. Maintenance crews were finishing their overnight cleaning, early shift nurses were checking in at the main desk, and the faint smell of disinfectant, mixed with cafeteria breakfast, created the distinctive aroma that had become as familiar to her as her own home. She waved to Carlos Gutierrez, the security guard who had worked there almost as long as she had, and exchanged morning pleasantries with Dr. Amanda Foster, who was just finishing up her overnight shift in the emergency room. Everything felt normal, routine, comfortable in the way that 8 years of working in the same place could make any environment feel like an extension of yourself. Sarah badged into the pediatric wing and headed toward the nurse's station to check her assignments for the day, expecting the usual mix of scheduled procedures, follow-up appointments, and whatever emergencies might walk through the doors. She had no way of knowing that her peaceful morning was about to be shattered by a conversation that would change everything. Michael Chen was already at his workstation when Sarah arrived, his dark hair still slightly messy from sleep, and his scrubs bearing the telltale wrinkles of someone who had gotten dressed in a hurry. He looked up from his computer screen with an expression that immediately set off warning bells in Sarah's mind. Michael was usually the cheerful one among their group, the nurse who could find humor in even the most stressful situations. But this morning his face carried a tension she rarely saw. "Sarah," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "We need to talk. Dr. Williams has been looking for you since 7 this morning. She seems really upset about something." The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in Sarah's mouth. Dr. Patricia Williams was the kind of supervisor who ruled through intimidation and rigid adherence to policy, a woman who seemed to view compassion as a weakness and who had made it clear that any deviation from hospital protocol would be met with swift consequences. Sarah had managed to stay on her good side for most of her career by keeping her head down and following the rules, but something in Michael's tone suggested that her luck might have run out. "Did she say what it was about?" Sarah asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Michael shook his head, but his expression suggested he had his own theories. "Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News was here earlier this morning, asking questions about Saturday's lake rescue. Apparently someone filmed you diving in to save those kids, and the story is starting to pick up traction on social media. The hospital's public relations department has been fielding calls since yesterday evening." Sarah felt her stomach drop. In all the adrenaline and focus of the rescue, she hadn't noticed anyone filming the incident, but in today's world of smartphones and instant sharing, she should have expected that dramatic moments like that would be captured and broadcast. The idea that her split-second decision to help 2 drowning children could somehow become a public relations issue for the hospital felt surreal and deeply unsettling. "Sarah Mitchell, report to Dr. Williams' office immediately." The announcement crackled through the hospital's PA system with an authority that made several nearby staff members look up from their work. Sarah could see the curiosity and concern in their faces, the way people looked when they sensed that someone was about to face serious trouble but didn't know why. The walk to Dr. Williams's office felt longer than usual, each step echoing in the quiet, administrative hallway. Sarah tried to prepare herself mentally for whatever was coming, running through the events of Saturday afternoon and trying to figure out what possible issue the hospital could have with her actions. She had saved 2 children's lives using her professional training and experience. She had acted quickly and effectively in an emergency situation. In any reasonable world, those facts would be cause for commendation, not disciplinary action. Dr. Patricia Williams's office was a sterile space that reflected its occupant's personality perfectly. The walls were lined with certificates and awards that spoke to her administrative achievements, but there were no personal touches, no photographs or mementos that might suggest warmth or humanity. Her desk was organized with military precision, every pen and paper clip in its designated place, and the woman herself sat behind it like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. Dr. Williams was in her mid-50s, with steel-grey hair pulled, back in a severe bun and glasses that seemed designed more for intimidation than vision correction. She had climbed the hospital's administrative ladder through a combination of political savvy and absolute dedication to policy compliance, and she viewed nurses like Sarah as potential liability issues waiting to happen. Her reputation for ending careers over minor infractions was well established, and she wore that reputation like armor. "Sit down, Ms. Mitchell," Dr. Williams said, without looking up from the file she was reviewing. Her voice carried the kind of controlled coldness that made even innocent people feel guilty. "I trust you know why you're here." Sarah took the chair across from the desk, trying to maintain her composure despite the growing sense that this conversation was going to be much worse than she had anticipated. "I assume it's about Saturday afternoon at Clearwater Lake, but I'm not sure what the issue would be." Dr. Williams finally looked up, her expression conveying the kind of disappointment usually reserved for serious wrongdoing. "The issue, Ms. Mitchell, is that you violated multiple hospital policies and potentially exposed this institution to significant legal liability. Your actions on Saturday were reckless, unauthorized, and completely inappropriate for someone representing Memorial General Hospital." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She'd expected maybe a conversation about media attention or public relations concerns, but this level of condemnation for saving children's lives felt like stepping into an alternate reality where basic human decency was somehow a punishable offense. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," Sarah said, working to keep her voice steady. "2 children were drowning, and I helped them. How is that a violation of hospital policy?" Dr. Williams opened the file on her desk and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. Hospital policy clearly states that employees are not authorized to provide medical care outside of approved hospital settings without prior administrative approval. Your actions at the lake constituted unauthorized medical intervention that could expose this hospital to malpractice claims, wrongful death lawsuits, and regulatory sanctions. Sarah felt the room spinning slightly as she processed the sheer absurdity of what she was hearing. They were drowning. I pulled them out of the water and made sure they were breathing. I didn't perform medical procedures or claim to be acting on behalf of the hospital. I acted as any human being would act in an emergency situation. "Any human being," Dr. Williams repeated with evident disdain, "is not a licensed medical professional employed by this institution. When you identified yourself to the responding officers as a pediatric nurse at Memorial General, you created a direct connection between your actions and this hospital's reputation. That connection makes us liable for any negative outcomes that might result from your intervention." The logic was so twisted that Sarah had to take a moment to fully grasp what was being suggested. According to Dr. Williams, the fact that Sarah had training and experience that made her rescue more likely to succeed somehow made her actions worse than if she had been an untrained bystander. The hospital was essentially arguing that their nurses should be less willing to help people in emergencies, not more willing. "Dr. Williams, with respect, those children would have died if I hadn't acted. There was no time to call the hospital for authorization, and frankly, I can't imagine any reasonable person expecting me to watch children drown while I sought administrative approval to help them." Dr. Williams closed the file with a sharp snap that echoed in the quiet office. "Your personal feelings about the situation are irrelevant, Ms. Mitchell. What matters is that you violated clearly established policies and created potential legal exposure for this institution. The hospital's legal team has reviewed the incident, and they've determined that disciplinary action is necessary to protect our interests." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. "What kind of disciplinary action?" "You're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation into your actions." During this leave, you'll have no access to hospital facilities. You'll surrender your identification badges and access cards, and you'll have no contact with patients or their families. The investigation will determine whether your employment with Memorial General Hospital can continue. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, toxic and suffocating. Sarah had worked at this hospital for 8 years, building relationships with colleagues and families, developing expertise and trust, creating a professional identity that had become central to who she was as a person. The idea that that could be destroyed because she had saved 2 children's lives felt like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. "This is unbelievable," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saved those children's lives. Emma and Jake Thompson are alive today because I acted quickly and effectively. How can that possibly be grounds for ending my career?" Dr. Williams stood up from behind her desk, signaling that the conversation was over. "Your employment status will be determined by the investigation, Ms. Mitchell. Until then, you're forbidden from representing yourself as an employee of this hospital or discussing this matter with members of the media. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings and surrender your credentials." As if summoned by the mention of security, Carlos Gutierrez appeared in the doorway, looking deeply uncomfortable with his assigned role. Sarah had known Carlos for years, had shared countless conversations about his grandchildren and her nursing. School experiences and the embarrassment on his face made the situation even more humiliating. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Carlos said quietly as they walked toward the pediatric wing. "This doesn't feel right to me, but I have to follow orders." The walk back to her workstation felt like a perp walk, with colleagues and staff members stopping their conversations to stare as Sarah collected her personal items under security escort. Michael Chen appeared at her side, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "This is insane," Michael said, not bothering to lower his voice. "You're being punished for being a hero. It's like they want us to be robots who only care about covering the hospital's liability instead of actually helping people." Other nurses began gathering around Sarah's workstation, their expressions ranging from confusion to outrage as word spread about what was happening. Dr. Amanda Foster appeared from the emergency room, still wearing scrubs from her overnight shift, her face showing the kind of incredulous anger that came from witnessing genuine injustice. "Sarah, this is completely wrong," Dr. Foster said, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "You did exactly what any of us would have done, and frankly, what any of us should do when children's lives are at stake. Don't let them make you feel like you did something wrong." Sarah appreciated the support, but she could see the fear in her colleagues' eyes beneath their expressions of solidarity. They all understood that if the hospital was willing to destroy her career for helping drowning children, none of them were safe from similar treatment if they ever found themselves in situations where human decency conflicted with administrative policy. As Sarah packed her personal belongings into a cardboard box, she thought about Emma and Jake Thompson and wondered how they were recovering from their ordeal. She hoped they were laughing and playing again, maybe splashing in bathtubs without fear, slowly forgetting the terror of that afternoon when the lake had nearly claimed their lives. The irony that her concern for their well-being was now being used to destroy her career felt like a cruel joke played by a universe that had lost its moral compass. The drive home from the hospital was a blur of conflicting emotions. Sarah felt anger at the system that valued liability protection over human life, sadness at the potential loss of a career she loved, and confusion about how a simple act of heroism had been transformed into professional misconduct. She also felt a growing determination not to let this injustice stand unchallenged, though she had no idea what resources she might have to fight an institution as powerful as Memorial General Hospital. What Sarah didn't know was that across town, Robert Thompson was having a very different kind of Monday morning. He had spent Sunday evening learning about the rescue of his children and trying to track down information about the woman who had saved them. His assistant, Mark, had provided him with Sarah's name and basic details, but Robert was a man who believed in thorough research before taking action. Robert Thompson's office occupied the entire top floor of the Thompson Industries building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of Riverside City. He had built his company from a small construction firm into a development empire that had reshaped significant portions of the city's landscape. His influence extended far beyond real estate into banking, local politics, and community organizations, making him one of the most powerful figures in the region. The preliminary report on Sarah Mitchell lay open on Robert's mahogany desk, revealing details about her career, her reputation among colleagues, and her exemplary record at Memorial General Hospital. The more he learned about the woman who had risked her own life to save Emma and Jake, the more impressed he became with her character and professionalism. The fact that she had acted without hesitation, without thought of personal gain or recognition, spoke to the kind of integrity that Robert valued above all other qualities. But as Monday afternoon progressed, Robert began receiving disturbing information about Sarah's treatment at the hospital. One of his business associates, who served on Memorial General's board of directors, mentioned in passing that a nurse was being disciplined for the Lake incident, describing it as a liability issue that needed to be handled carefully. The casual way the board member discussed the potential destruction of Sarah's career, as if it were merely an administrative detail, triggered something deep and powerful in Robert's protective instincts. By evening, Robert had learned about Sarah's administrative leave and the investigation that threatened her livelihood. The same woman who had saved his children without a moment's hesitation was now facing professional ruin because of that act of heroism. The injustice of the situation was so profound that Robert found himself unable to focus on anything else, his mind already beginning to formulate plans that would ensure Sarah Mitchell received the recognition and protection she deserved. As Sarah sat in her apartment that Monday night, staring at her nursing credentials and wondering if her career was over, she had no way of knowing that the father of the children she had saved was learning about her situation and beginning to mobilize resources that would soon change everything. The battle lines were being drawn for a confrontation that would test the limits of institutional power and reveal the true cost of doing what's right in a world that often rewards conformity over courage. The stage was set for a reckoning that none of the players fully understood yet, but which would ultimately demonstrate that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected sources and that acts of genuine heroism have a way of creating their own momentum toward truth and fairness. The Thompson family estate sat like a crown jewel on the rolling hills overlooking Riverside City, its contemporary architecture blending seamlessly with the natural landscape that surrounded it. Massive glass panels reflected the changing sky, while stone and steel created clean lines that spoke of understated elegance rather than ostentatious display. The property encompassed 12 acres of carefully maintained grounds, complete with tennis courts, a swimming pool that seemed to flow into the horizon, and gardens that bloomed in carefully orchestrated succession throughout the seasons. Inside the main house, Emma and Jake Thompson were recovering from their ordeal with the resilience that only children possess. Their mother, Claire, had barely left their sides since returning from the hospital, checking on them constantly and trying to process her own trauma from nearly losing both of her children in a single terrifying moment. The twins bore few physical signs of their brush with drowning, but Claire could see the way they hesitated near water now, the subtle flinch when bath time arrived, the careful distance they maintained from the backyard pool. Robert Thompson stood in his home office, a space that rivaled many corporate boardrooms in its sophistication and technological capabilities. Multiple monitors displayed real-time information about his various business interests, from construction projects across 3 states to stock portfolios that shifted values by the minute. But for the first time in recent memory, Robert's attention wasn't focused on profit margins or development timelines. Instead, he was studying a comprehensive dossier that his private investigator had compiled about Sarah Mitchell and the circumstances surrounding her suspension from Memorial General Hospital. The woman who had saved his children was 32 years old, unmarried, and had dedicated her entire adult life to caring for sick and injured children. Her performance reviews at the hospital were exceptional, filled with commendations from doctors, appreciation from families, and recognition for her ability to remain calm and effective in high-pressure situations. She had no disciplinary history, no complaints filed against her, and a reputation among her colleagues as someone who genuinely cared about her patients' well-being above all else. What made Robert's blood pressure rise was the growing evidence that Sarah's punishment was less about legitimate policy concerns and more about the hospital's paranoid obsession with avoiding any potential liability. His business attorney had reviewed the hospital's stated reasons for the disciplinary action and had characterized them as legally questionable and ethically indefensible. The fact that Memorial General was willing to destroy the career of an exemplary nurse to protect themselves from imaginary lawsuits revealed a level of institutional cowardice that Robert found personally offensive. Robert had built his fortune by taking calculated risks and backing people who demonstrated integrity under pressure. Sarah Mitchell had shown exactly that kind of character when she dove into Clearwater Lake without hesitation, and the hospital's response to her heroism told him everything he needed to know about their priorities and leadership. He was beginning to formulate a response that would not only protect Sarah, but also send a clear message about the consequences of punishing people for doing the right thing. The preliminary research had revealed something that even Robert's experienced investigative team found remarkable. Sarah Mitchell had no idea who she had saved that day at the lake. Unlike many people who might have researched the families involved or sought recognition for their heroic actions, Sarah had simply moved on with her life, satisfied with the knowledge that she had helped children in need. Her complete lack of awareness about the Thompson family's prominence in Riverside City was both refreshing and strategically useful for what Robert was planning. Claire Thompson appeared in the doorway of Robert's office, still wearing the haunted expression that had become familiar since Saturday's incident. Despite their wealth and the security it provided, she had been reminded that some dangers couldn't be prevented by money or influence, and the randomness of her children's near drowning had shaken her faith in their ability to protect what mattered most. "The twins are asking about the lady who helped them," Claire said, settling into one of the leather chairs that faced Robert's desk. "They want to write her a thank you note, but I realized we never got her contact information. I was too focused on getting them to the hospital to think about anything else." Robert looked up from the dossier, his expression thoughtful. "Sarah Mitchell. She's a pediatric nurse at Memorial General, or at least she was, until they suspended her for saving our children." Claire's eyes widened in shock and confusion. "Suspended? That doesn't make any sense. She's a hero. She risked her own life to save Emma and Jake." "The hospital is claiming she violated policies by providing unauthorized medical care outside of approved settings," Robert explained, his voice carrying an edge of controlled anger. "They're concerned about potential liability issues and are conducting an investigation that could end her career." The injustice of the situation hit Claire like a physical blow. She thought about Sarah's calm professionalism as she had checked The twins' breathing and pulse, the gentle way she had explained what needed to happen next, the quiet confidence that had helped keep a terrifying situation from becoming completely chaotic. The idea that those same qualities were now being used against her felt like a betrayal of everything decent and rational. "We have to do something," Claire said, her voice rising with emotion. "That woman saved our children's lives. We can't let them destroy her career because she helped us." Robert nodded slowly, his fingers steepled as he considered the various options available to them. "I've been thinking about this situation all day, and I believe there are several approaches we could take. The question is how direct we want to be and how quickly we want to act." Over the next hour, Robert outlined the scope of his family's influence within Riverside City's power structure. Thompson Industries was the largest private employer in the region, with business relationships that extended into banking, healthcare, municipal government, and media. The company's construction projects had reshaped significant portions of the city's infrastructure, and Robert's personal philanthropic efforts had funded everything from school construction to hospital expansions. More specifically relevant to Sarah's situation, Thompson Industries had been the primary financial backer for Memorial General Hospital's new pediatric wing, a $50 million expansion that had been completed just 2 years earlier. Robert's name was prominently displayed in the hospital's main lobby, and his continued support was considered essential for the medical center's ongoing development plans. The irony that Sarah worked in a wing of the hospital that existed largely because of Robert's generosity was not lost on either of them. "I could make some phone calls," Robert said, his tone suggesting that such calls would carry considerable weight. "Lisa Rodriguez chairs the hospital's board of directors, and she's been trying to get Thompson Industries to fund their new cardiac center for the past 6 months. I imagine she would be very interested in hearing my thoughts about how the hospital treats people who save children's lives." Claire felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. "Do you think that would be enough to get Sarah her job back?" "It would certainly get their attention," Robert replied. "But I'm thinking about something more comprehensive than just reversing the disciplinary action. Sarah Mitchell deserves recognition for what she did, not just protection from petty administrators who are more concerned with covering their own liability than supporting excellent nurses." As they discussed potential strategies, Robert's phone rang with a call from his longtime friend and business associate, Judge Harrison Wells. The judge had seen the news coverage of the lake rescue and was calling to congratulate Robert on his children's safety. But the conversation quickly turned to more serious matters when Robert explained what was happening to Sarah. "That's absolutely outrageous," Judge Wells said, his voice carrying the moral authority that came from 30 years on the bench. "I've seen a lot of institutional cowardice in my career, but punishing someone for saving children's lives reaches a new low. What kind of message does that send to other healthcare workers about doing the right thing in emergency situations?" The judge's perspective reinforced Robert's growing conviction that this situation demanded more than quiet negotiations or behind-the-scenes pressure. Sarah Mitchell had become a symbol of everything that was right about people who chose careers in public service, and her treatment by the hospital represented everything that was wrong with institutions that prioritized self-protection over their stated missions. "Harrison, I'm going to need some advice about the legal aspects of what I'm planning," Robert said. "I want to make sure that when we act, we do it in a way that creates lasting change, not just temporary embarrassment for the people responsible." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour and covered everything from employment law to public relations strategy. Judge Wells had connections throughout the legal community, and he promised to reach out to colleagues who specialized in healthcare employment issues to ensure that any action they took would be legally sound and strategically effective. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah Mitchell was experiencing the strangest week of her professional life. The forced administrative leave had created an odd vacuum in her daily routine, leaving her with time to think about her situation, but little ability to take meaningful action. She had contacted the nurses' union, but their representative had been cautious about challenging hospital administration on policy issues, especially when those policies were ostensibly designed to protect the institution from legal liability. Sarah's apartment felt smaller than usual as she paced between rooms, trying to process the reality that her career might be over, because she had acted on her most fundamental instincts as both a nurse and a human being. She had spent 8 years building expertise and relationships that made her effective at helping children through medical crises, and the possibility of losing all of that because she had helped children in a different kind of crisis felt like a cosmic joke with devastating personal consequences. The local news coverage of the rescue had been overwhelmingly positive, with several outlets characterizing Sarah as a hero and questioning the hospital's response to her actions. Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 had been particularly supportive, describing the disciplinary action as an example of bureaucratic overreach that sent the wrong message about helping people in emergencies. But positive media coverage wouldn't restore Sarah's access to her workplace or guarantee that the investigation would conclude in her favor. What troubled Sarah most was the growing realization that her situation was bigger than just one nurse's employment status. If Memorial General Hospital could destroy her career for saving drowning children, what did that mean for other healthcare workers who might face similar choices between following policies and following their consciences? The precedent being set could have implications that extended far beyond her personal circumstances. On Wednesday evening, Sarah received a phone call that would begin to change everything. Lisa Rodriguez, the chairwoman of Memorial General's board of directors, requested a private meeting to discuss the situation and explore possible resolutions. The call was polite but formal, with Ms. Rodriguez explaining that the board was conducting its own review of the incident and wanted to hear Sarah's perspective directly. The meeting was scheduled for Friday morning at the hospital's administrative offices, and Ms. Rodriguez assured Sarah that the conversation would be confidential and focused on finding a path forward that served everyone's interests. The tone suggested that the hospital might be reconsidering its position, though Sarah couldn't be sure whether that was genuine or just another attempt to manage the public relations aspects of the controversy. What Sarah didn't know was that Lisa Rodriguez had spent Wednesday afternoon in an increasingly uncomfortable conversation with Robert Thompson about Thompson Industries' future relationship with Memorial General Hospital. Robert had been characteristically direct in expressing his thoughts about how the hospital was treating the woman who had saved his children, and he had made it clear that his continued support for the institution would depend on how they resolved Sarah's situation. The conversation had been civil but unmistakably serious, with Robert laying out his expectations in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. He wanted Sarah Mitchell reinstated with full recognition for her heroic actions, and he wanted assurance that the hospital would revise its policies to prevent similar situations in the future. Most importantly, he wanted the hospital's leadership to understand that their treatment of Sarah was being viewed as a test of their institutional character and values. Lisa Rodriguez was an experienced administrator who understood the delicate balance between medical excellence, financial stability, and community relations that kept major hospitals operating successfully. She also understood that Thompson Industries' continued support was essential for Memorial General's expansion plans and ongoing financial health. The choice between protecting Dr. Williams's administrative authority and maintaining Robert Thompson's goodwill was not really a choice at all. As Friday morning approached, Multiple forces were converging on a resolution that none of the original participants could have predicted. Sarah was preparing to defend actions she considered morally obvious and professionally appropriate. Dr. Williams was preparing to justify policies she viewed as essential for protecting institutional interests. Lisa Rodriguez was preparing to navigate between competing pressures while maintaining the hospital's reputation and relationships. And Robert Thompson was preparing to demonstrate that true power in a community came not just from wealth or influence, but from the willingness to use those resources to protect people who had shown courage and integrity when it mattered most. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the true priorities of everyone involved and establish precedents that would influence how similar situations were handled for years to come. The quiet investigation that had begun with a nurse's suspension was about to become a very public examination of institutional values, personal responsibility, and the question of whether doing the right thing would ultimately be rewarded or punished in a system that claimed to prioritize patient care above all else. Friday morning dawned grey and overcast, with heavy clouds promising rain that seemed to mirror the tension building inside Memorial General Hospital's administrative wing. Sarah Mitchell sat in her car in the visitor parking lot, staring up at the building where she had spent 8 years of her life caring for children and building what she had thought was an unshakable career. The irony of having to park in the visitor section of her own workplace wasn't lost on her, another small reminder that she was now considered an outsider in a place that had once felt like home. She had dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a navy blue suit that conveyed professionalism without appearing too formal, wanting to strike the right balance between respect for the process and confidence in her own position. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked her watch, though whether from nervousness or suppressed anger, she couldn't be sure. The past week had been an emotional roller coaster that had challenged everything she thought she knew about fairness, institutional loyalty, and the price of doing what felt morally right. Inside the hospital, preparations were underway for what everyone understood would be a pivotal meeting. Lisa Rodriguez had arrived early, spending time reviewing Sarah's personnel file and the legal opinions that had been quietly solicited from the hospital's outside counsel. The lawyers had been unanimous in their assessment that the disciplinary action against Sarah was legally questionable and potentially damaging to the hospital's reputation, especially given the positive media coverage surrounding the rescue. Dr. Patricia Williams sat in her office, reviewing her notes and preparing her defense of the hospital's policies with the methodical precision that had characterized her entire administrative career. She genuinely believed that allowing employees to act outside established protocols, regardless of the circumstances, would create dangerous precedents that could expose the institution to countless liability issues. In her mind, the emotional appeal of Sarah's heroic actions couldn't be allowed to override the practical necessity of maintaining clear boundaries around professional conduct. What none of them knew was that Robert Thompson had arrived at the hospital 20 minutes earlier, though he hadn't announced his presence to anyone in the administrative offices. Instead, he had gone directly to the pediatric wing, where he was currently sitting in the family lounge area, observing the daily operations of the department where Sarah had spent her career. He wanted to see firsthand the environment where she had worked and to speak with her colleagues before the formal meeting began. Michael Chen was the first to notice the well-dressed stranger sitting quietly in the corner of the lounge, reading what appeared to be medical journals, while occasionally watching the interactions between nurses and families. There was something about the man's intense focus and obvious comfort in the hospital environment that suggested he wasn't just another anxious family member waiting for news about a loved one. "Excuse me," Michael said, approaching with the friendly professionalism that made him popular with both colleagues and families. I'm Michael Chen, one of the nurses here. Is there anything I can help you with? Are you waiting to meet with someone? Robert looked up with a slight smile, extending his hand in greeting. Robert Thompson, I'm actually here for a meeting with the administration, but I wanted to spend some time in this department first. My children were patients here briefly after an incident last weekend, and I was hoping to learn more about the nurses who work in pediatrics. The name didn't immediately register with Michael, though something about the man's calm authority and expensive suit suggested he was someone significant. Well, you've come to the right place. We have an amazing team here. Is there anything specific you'd like to know about our department? Actually, I'm particularly interested in hearing about Sarah Mitchell. I understand she's one of your colleagues. Michael's expression immediately shifted, a combination of sadness and anger crossing his face. Sarah is one of the best nurses I've ever worked with. She's been suspended this week for helping 2 drowning children, which is probably the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my entire career. The administration is calling it a policy violation, but anyone with common sense would call it heroism. Robert nodded thoughtfully, his expression encouraging Michael to continue. Tell me more about what kind of nurse she is. How do the families respond to her? Over the next 15 minutes, Michael painted a picture of Sarah's professional life that reinforced everything Robert's investigation had revealed. Parents specifically requested Sarah for their children's care because of her combination of technical expertise and genuine warmth. She had a gift for explaining complex medical situations in terms that families could understand, and she never seemed too busy to address concerns or provide comfort during stressful times. There was this one family last year, Michael said, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a treasured memory. Their 6-year-old daughter was here for weeks with a rare condition, and the parents were terrified. Sarah spent her lunch breaks reading to the little girl and taught the parents how to do some basic care procedures so they could feel more involved. When the child finally went home, the mother told me that Sarah had saved not just her daughter, but their whole family's sanity. Dr. Amanda Foster appeared from one of the patient rooms, having overheard part of the conversation. She immediately recognized Robert as someone important, though she couldn't place exactly who he was. "Are you a hospital board member?" she asked. "I don't think we've met." "Not exactly," Robert replied, "but I do have a strong interest in how this hospital treats its most valuable employees. I was just hearing about Sarah Mitchell's work with families." Dr. Foster's expression darkened immediately. "Sarah's suspension is a disgrace to everything this hospital claims to stand for. She's being punished for demonstrating exactly the kind of quick thinking and compassion that makes her an exceptional nurse. It's sending a terrible message to everyone who works here about what happens when you put patients ahead of paperwork." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the hospital's PA system requesting that all parties involved in the Mitchell disciplinary review report to Conference Room A in the administrative wing. Robert thanked Michael and Dr. Foster for their insights, then made his way toward the elevator with a growing sense of determination about what needed to happen in the next hour. Sarah arrived at Conference Room A with precisely 2 minutes to spare, her stomach churning with nervous energy as she prepared to defend actions that felt as natural and necessary as breathing. The room was larger than she had expected, with a polished mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs and windows that offered a view of the city skyline. Lisa Rodriguez was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who Sarah assumed were hospital lawyers. Dr. Patricia Williams sat across from where Sarah had been directed to sit, her expression as stern and unyielding as ever. She had prepared a comprehensive presentation defending the hospital's policies and the necessity of maintaining clear boundaries around employee conduct, regardless of the circumstances that might seem to justify exceptions. Ms. Mitchell, thank you for coming, Lisa Rodriguez began, her tone professionally neutral. Before we begin our discussion, I want you to know that this review is being conducted with the goal of finding a resolution that serves everyone's interests while maintaining the integrity of our institutional policies. Sarah nodded, though she wondered what kind of resolution could possibly satisfy both her need for professional vindication and the hospital's apparent obsession with avoiding any potential liability. She had prepared her own statement defending her actions, but she also understood that the power dynamics in the room were heavily stacked against her. I'd like to start by having Dr. Williams explain the hospital's position regarding the incident at Clearwater Lake, Lisa continued. Then we'll hear from Ms. Mitchell, and finally we'll discuss potential paths forward. Dr. Williams launched into her prepared presentation with the confidence of someone who believed absolutely in the correctness of her position. She outlined the hospital's liability concerns, the importance of maintaining clear protocols for employee conduct, and the potential consequences of allowing staff members to act outside established guidelines, even in emergency situations. The fundamental issue, Dr. Williams explained, is that when Ms. Mitchell identified herself as a Memorial General employee while providing unauthorized medical intervention, she created a direct liability connection between her actions and this institution. If anything had gone wrong during the rescue, or if the children had suffered any complications, the hospital could have faced significant legal exposure. Sarah listened with growing incredulity as Dr. Williams essentially argued that the hospital would have been better off if she had let Emma and Jake Thompson drown rather than risk potential lawsuits. The twisted logic of prioritizing theoretical legal problems over actual human lives seemed to epitomize everything that was wrong with modern healthcare administration. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah kept her response simple and direct. 2 children were drowning, and I had the training and ability to help them. I would make the same choice again without hesitation, because saving lives is why I became a nurse in the first place. If this hospital wants to punish me for that, then maybe this isn't the right place for someone with my values to work. The room fell silent as Sarah's words hung in the air, her quiet dignity providing a stark contrast to Dr. Williams's bureaucratic justifications. Lisa Rodriguez was about to respond when there was a soft knock on the conference room door. "I'm sorry to interrupt," said Mark Thompson, Robert's assistant, as he stepped into the room, "but Mr. Thompson would like to join this meeting if that's acceptable." Lisa Rodriguez looked confused. "Mr. Thompson? I'm not sure I understand." "Robert Thompson, from Thompson Industries," Mark clarified, "the father of the children Ms. Mitchell rescued last weekend." The effect of this announcement was immediate and dramatic. Dr. Williams went pale, her confident presentation suddenly seeming inadequate for a situation that had just become much more complicated. Lisa Rodriguez straightened in her chair, her mind racing through the implications of having Robert Thompson personally involved in what she had hoped would be a quiet, administrative matter. Robert entered the room with the calm authority that had made him successful in business and influential in community affairs. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit, his presence immediately shifting the dynamics of the entire meeting. He nodded politely to everyone present, then took a seat directly across from Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice warm with genuine gratitude, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Robert Thompson, and Emma and Jake are my children. I wanted to thank you personally for saving their lives." Sarah's eyes widened in shock as she finally made the connection between the family she had helped and the man sitting across from her. She had been so focused on the children's immediate medical needs that she had never thought to ask about their family background or circumstances. "I was just doing what anyone would do in that situation," Sarah replied, though her voice carried a slight tremor as she began to understand the potential significance of Robert's presence. "Actually," Robert said, turning his attention to the rest of the room, "that's not entirely accurate. Most people would have hesitated or waited for professional help to arrive or found reasons why they weren't qualified to act. Ms. Mitchell saw children in mortal danger and responded instantly, with the kind of courage and competence that saved 2 precious lives." Lisa Rodriguez was desperately trying to recalibrate her approach to the meeting, recognizing that the hospital's relationship with Robert Thompson was far too important to jeopardize over personnel policies. "Mr. Thompson, we certainly appreciate your perspective on this matter, and we're grateful that your children are safe. However, this is an internal personnel review that involves complex policy considerations." Robert's expression remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath his polite demeanor. "Ms. Rodriguez, I understand that you have institutional concerns to consider. However, I also have concerns as a parent whose children are alive today because of Ms. Mitchell's heroism, and as a significant supporter of this hospital who expects better from its leadership." The mention of his support for the hospital sent a clear message that everyone in the room understood immediately. Robert Thompson's philanthropy had funded major portions of Memorial General's recent expansion, and his continued partnership was essential for the institution's future development plans. "Dr. Williams," Robert continued, turning toward the woman who had orchestrated Sarah's suspension, "I've reviewed your policy justifications for punishing Ms. Mitchell, and I find them both morally bankrupt and strategically short-sighted. You're essentially arguing that this hospital's nurses should prioritize liability concerns over saving children's lives, which makes me question whether this institution deserves the community support it has enjoyed." Dr. Williams attempted to defend her position, but her usual confidence had evaporated in the face of Robert's controlled intensity. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your emotional investment in this situation, but policy decisions must be based on institutional needs rather than individual circumstances, however compelling they might be. Let me be very clear about something," Robert said, his voice remaining calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Ms. Mitchell's actions weren't just individually heroic, they represent exactly the kind of values and quick thinking that this community should expect from its healthcare workers. Punishing her sends a message that this hospital values legal protection over human life, which is antithetical to everything a medical institution should represent." The room was completely silent as Robert's words settled over the assembled group. Sarah sat in stunned amazement, watching as the man whose children she had saved systematically dismantled the case against her with a combination of moral clarity and institutional leverage that she never could have mustered on her own. Lisa Rodriguez realized that the meeting had reached a turning point that would determine not just Sarah's future, but the hospital's relationship with one of its most important supporters. The choice between backing Dr. Williams's policies and accommodating Robert Thompson's expectations was becoming increasingly clear, and the institutional mathematics strongly favored finding a resolution that would satisfy the father of the children Sarah had saved. The silence in Conference Room A stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably no more than 30 seconds. Lisa Rodriguez found herself caught between the institutional policies she was supposed to uphold and the undeniable reality that Robert Thompson's continued support was essential for Memorial General's future. She glanced at the hospital lawyers, flanking her, noting their subtle nods toward accommodation rather than confrontation. "Mr. Thompson," Lisa finally said, her voice carefully measured, "I think we may have approached this situation with an overly narrow focus on policy compliance, rather than recognizing the broader context of Ms. Mitchell's actions. Perhaps we should reconsider our initial assessment. Dr. Patricia Williams looked as though she had been physically struck. Her entire administrative philosophy was built on rigid adherence to established protocols, and the suggestion that exceptions could be made based on circumstances or external pressure threatened the foundation of her authority within the hospital. Hierarchy. Ms. Rodriguez, with respect, we cannot allow individual cases, however emotionally compelling, to undermine the systematic approach that protects this institution from liability exposure, Dr. Williams said, her voice rising slightly. With desperation, if we make exceptions for Ms. Mitchell, every future policy violation will be justified by appeals to special circumstances. Robert Thompson turned his attention to Dr. Williams with the kind of focused intensity that had made him successful in countless business negotiations. Dr. Williams, I understand your concern about maintaining institutional order. However, your approach seems to assume that policies should be inflexible, regardless of their impact on human life or institutional reputation. That's not leadership, it's bureaucratic cowardice. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Sarah watched in fascination as the woman who had destroyed her career less than a week ago struggled to maintain her composure. Under Robert's systematic dismantling of her position, there was something almost surreal about watching her professional fate being decided by forces completely beyond her control or influence. Furthermore, Robert continued, I've taken the liberty of reviewing Memorial General's mission statement, which prominently features commitments to compassionate care and community service. Ms. Mitchell's actions at Clearwater Lake embodied those values perfectly, while your response has contradicted them entirely. Lisa Rodriguez was rapidly calculating the cost of different courses of action. Backing Dr. Williams might preserve some administrative authority, but it would almost certainly damage the hospital's relationship with Robert Thompson and potentially impact millions of dollars in future funding. Supporting Sarah Mitchell would require admitting institutional error, but it would also demonstrate that the hospital prioritized its stated values over bureaucratic face-saving. Mr. Thompson, Lisa said, what would you consider an appropriate resolution to this situation? Robert had clearly anticipated this question and was prepared with a comprehensive response. First, Ms. Mitchell should be immediately reinstated with full recognition that her actions were heroic rather than problematic. Second, she should receive formal commendation from the hospital board for her courage and quick thinking. Third, the policies that were used to justify her suspension should be reviewed and revised to ensure that future employees are encouraged rather than punished for providing emergency assistance. Sarah felt her heart racing as she listened. To Robert outline demands that exceeded anything she had dared to hope for. Not only was he advocating for her reinstatement, but he was pushing for recognition and systemic changes that would protect other healthcare workers who might face similar situations in the future. And finally, Robert added, his tone becoming more personal, I think it would be appropriate for Dr. Williams to publicly acknowledge that her initial assessment was incorrect and that Ms. Mitchell deserves the hospital's gratitude rather than its punishment. Dr. Williams looked as though she might faint. The suggestion that she should publicly admit error and praise someone she had just suspended was tantamount to professional humiliation. Her face flushed red with a combination of anger and embarrassment as she realized that her rigid adherence to policy had put her on the wrong side of a battle she couldn't win. That's completely unreasonable, Dr. Williams protested. My assessment was based on legitimate institutional concerns and established protocols. I won't be forced to apologize for protecting this hospital's interests. Robert's expression remained calm, but there was steel in his voice when he responded. Dr. Williams, your assessment was based on a narrow interpretation of policies. that prioritize theoretical liability over actual human life. That's not protecting the hospital's interests. It's betraying everything this institution claims to represent. Lisa Rodriguez realized that the meeting had reached a point where decisive action was necessary. Continuing to debate the merits of different positions would only prolong an uncomfortable situation while potentially damaging important relationships. She had the authority to resolve the matter, and the institutional mathematics clearly favored accommodation over confrontation. "I think we've heard enough perspectives to make an informed decision," Lisa announced, her tone indicating that the discussion phase was ending. "Ms. Mitchell, effective immediately, your administrative leave is terminated and you're reinstated to your position in the pediatric wing with full back pay for the time you were suspended." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she was still processing the surreal nature of having her career rescued by the father of the children she had saved. The vindication felt even sweeter because it came with recognition that her actions had been appropriate rather than problematic. "Additionally," Lisa continued, "the hospital board will be drafting a formal commendation recognizing your heroic actions at Clearwater Lake and your exemplary service to our pediatric patients. We're proud to have nurses like you representing Memorial General in our community." Robert nodded with satisfaction, but his expression indicated that he wasn't finished with his agenda for the meeting. "That's an excellent start, Ms. Rodriguez. I'm also interested in discussing the broader policy implications of this situation. How will the hospital ensure that future employees understand they're expected to help people in emergencies rather than worry about administrative consequences?" The question prompted a lengthy discussion about policy revisions and training, programs that would clarify the hospital's expectations around emergency response. Sarah listened with growing amazement as Robert systematically addressed every concern she had raised about the precedent her case might set for other healthcare workers. Dr. Williams sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence as the conversation moved forward without her input. Her authority had been undermined not through direct confrontation, but through simple irrelevance, as more powerful forces shaped the outcome according to different priorities. The realization that her rigid approach to administration had backfired so spectacularly was professionally devastating. "Dr. Williams," Lisa said, finally addressing the woman whose policies had created the crisis, "I'd like you to work with Ms. Mitchell on implementing these policy revisions. Your experience with administrative procedures will be valuable in ensuring that the new guidelines are clear and comprehensive." The assignment was both a face-saving gesture and a subtle punishment, requiring Dr. Williams to participate in dismantling the very policies she had used to justify Sarah's suspension. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room, though the professional courtesy of the phrasing allowed her to maintain some dignity while accepting the new reality. "Mr. Thompson," Lisa continued, "I want to thank you for bringing your perspective to this matter. Your insights have helped us reach a resolution that serves everyone's interests while reinforcing our institutional values." Robert stood to leave, but paused to address Sarah directly. "Ms. Mitchell, my family owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. Emma and Jake are alive today because of your courage and quick thinking. Please know that you'll always have the gratitude and support of the Thompson family." Sarah finally found her voice, though it was thick with emotion. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that I would make the same choice again without hesitation. Your children are wonderful, and I'm just grateful I was in the right place at the right time to help them." "Actually," Robert said with a slight smile, "I think you were exactly where you needed to be, both at the lake and in this hospital. Nurses like you make this community a better place for all of our families." As the meeting concluded and people began filing out of the conference room, Sarah remained seated for a moment, trying to process the dramatic reversal of her professional fortunes. Less than an hour ago, She had been facing potential career destruction. Now she was being reinstated with commendation and policy changes that would protect future colleagues from similar persecution. Michael Chen was waiting in the hallway when Sarah emerged from the administrative wing, having heard through the hospital grapevine that something significant was happening with her case. His face lit up when he saw her expression immediately, recognizing the look of someone who had just received life-changing good news. "Sarah, please tell me that expression means what I think it means," Michael said, his voice filled with hope and anticipation. "I'm back," Sarah said simply, though her smile conveyed the full magnitude of her relief and gratitude. "Full reinstatement, back pay, and they're changing the policies that were used to suspend me." Michael let out a whoop of joy that attracted attention from nearby staff members, who quickly gathered around as word spread that Sarah had been vindicated. Dr. Amanda Foster appeared from the emergency room, her face showing the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing justice served after witnessing obvious unfairness. "This is exactly what should have happened," Dr. Foster said, embracing Sarah warmly. "You never should have been suspended in the first place, and I'm glad someone finally came to their senses." Over the next hour, as Sarah made her way back to the pediatric wing to resume her duties, she was greeted with congratulations and expressions of support from colleagues throughout the hospital. The nursing staff had been quietly outraged by her suspension, and her reinstatement was being celebrated as a victory for healthcare workers who prioritized patient care over administrative convenience. Carlos Gutierrez, the security guard who had been forced to escort Sarah out of the building, was particularly emotional when he saw her returning to work. "Sarah, I'm so sorry I had to do that to you," he said, his voice thick with regret. "That was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in this job." "Carlos, you were just following orders," Sarah replied, touching his arm gently. "I never blamed you for doing your job. I'm just glad everything worked out in the end." The story of Sarah's reinstatement spread quickly through Riverside City's medical community, becoming a symbol of the importance of supporting healthcare workers who demonstrated courage and compassion in difficult situations. Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News covered the resolution extensively, framing it as a victory for common sense over bureaucratic overreach. More importantly for Sarah, the experience had reinforced her faith in the fundamental goodness of people and the possibility that doing the right thing would ultimately be rewarded rather than punished. Robert Thompson's intervention had saved her career, but it had also demonstrated that there were still people in positions of power who were willing to use their influence to protect those who served others. 3 weeks later, Sarah received an invitation to attend a special ceremony at City Hall, where Mayor Patricia Hendricks would be presenting her with the Riverside City Medal of Valor for her heroic actions at Clearwater Lake. The ceremony would be attended by Robert and Claire Thompson, along with Emma and Jake, who had fully recovered from their ordeal and were eager to thank Sarah publicly for saving their lives. As Sarah stood before the assembled crowd, wearing her dress uniform from nursing school and holding a medal that recognized her courage, she thought about the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. A split-second decision to help. Drowning children had nearly destroyed her career, then ultimately led to recognition and policy changes that would benefit countless future colleagues. Emma and Jake Thompson approached the podium after the ceremony, each carrying a handmade card with drawings of Sarah pulling them from the lake. Their artwork was crude but heartfelt, showing stick figures with enormous smiles and the words, "Thank you, hero lady," written in crayon across the top. "We wanted you to know that we think about you every day," Emma said, her young voice carrying a seriousness that belied her 8 years. "You saved our lives, and we're going to be nurses when we grow up so we can help people just like you did." Sarah knelt down to accept the cards, her eyes filling with tears as she realized that her actions had inspired the next generation of healthcare workers. The idea that Emma and Jake might someday become nurses because of her example was more meaningful than any formal recognition or career vindication. As the ceremony concluded and families began to disperse, Robert Thompson approached Sarah one final time. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that Thompson Industries is establishing a scholarship fund for nursing students in your honor. We want to ensure that future healthcare workers understand that courage and compassion are valued and supported in this community." The scholarship fund would become Sarah's lasting legacy, supporting dozens of nursing students over the coming years and ensuring that her story continued to inspire people long after the immediate controversy had been forgotten. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was much simpler. She had been able to continue doing the work she loved, caring for children who needed her expertise and compassion. That evening, as Sarah returned to her apartment after the ceremony, she found a package waiting outside her door. Inside was a photo album containing pictures from Emma and Jake's 8th birthday party, which had been held the weekend after their rescue. The children were laughing and playing with friends, their faces bright with the joy that only comes from being alive and healthy and surrounded by people who love them. A note from Claire Thompson was tucked inside the front cover. "Sarah, every moment of happiness in these pictures exists because of your courage. Thank you for giving us back our children and for showing us what real heroism looks like. With endless gratitude, the Thompson family." Sarah closed the album and looked out her window at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Emma and Jake were probably sleeping peacefully in their beds, dreaming the dreams of children who had been given a second chance at life. The knowledge that she had played a role in preserving those dreams was worth more than any recognition or reward she could ever receive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.